8th class on this Tanya series. So it's been going for quite a while, but we are going through a work that is 53 chapters long. And as it is, we're doing it relatively concisely, just, to give us an overview and take out most of the key ideas. I believe next week will probably be the final class in this series, just so you know what's up ahead. And then we'll have probably 2 weeks to maybe talk about Passover a little bit and the deeper meaning of that as we get ready and we get closer. So last week we spoke a lot about the idea of making the world more receptive to and more transparent of godliness, right? When we utilize physical objects or when we do good deeds with our bodies, whether it's with we say a blessing or a kind word with our mouth, or we use our hands to give charity or light Shabbat candles, or the physical objects that we engage with in order to fulfill the commandments. We spoke about different examples, all these different ways in which we utilize different parts of the world around us in order to make it a place where God is able to be welcomed and absorbed and received. And then it's more apparent how things were created for a higher purpose and for a specific goal. So if you thought about that sometime during this week, or it's something you can think about at any time, how much of the physical resources that we use are actually expressing God's will in the simplest ways. We can recognize how there's really the potential for a lot of meaning to be infused in all these things that we interact with and we do anyway. And I think that if we just stop for a moment and think about that idea, it's quite amazing. And I think it can help us feel quite empowered. Mm-hmm. So today we're going to talk about the intentions and the motivations behind the mitzvahs and the good deeds that we do. Because while we made it very, very clear that action alone creates a dwelling place for God, it makes God feel more comfortable and more welcome into this world. We know in Judaism, there's levels, right? And there is a way for us to upgrade this home that we are creating for God. How do we upgrade this dwelling? When we do a good deed, when we are involved in a mitzvah, we don't just fulfill the mitzvah on the technical level, but we have feeling or specific intentions when we are fulfilling that mitzvah. And I'm just going to introduce this concept by sharing a video with you from an encounter that a then young man had with the Lubavitcher Rebbe that speaks about this idea, and we are going to develop it from there. So I will share that with you right now.
Rabbi Chaim Shner Nissenbaum is a Chabad representative in Paris, France. As a college student in 1972, he had his first audience with the Rebbe.
At the time, I was obviously already involved in Lubavitch, so I gave lectures, and I already was a speaker, and I felt bad with it. Because as I told the Rebbe, I don't know if I have enough Ahavas Yisrael to do it. Not looking at people from above. And the only thing, and I'm afraid that I'm growing in Gaiva. I don't know if it's so good. Maybe somebody else can do it. It was a very earnest question. You know, when you entered the Rebbe, you didn't imagine to conceal something. You said everything. He told me in French, il faut faire toutes les choses qui sont bonnes. You have to do all the things which are good. Meaning that we don't have to ask so many questions. The first thing is not what we think, what we feel, is what we do. So when you see something good to do, don't hesitate and do it. And from that time, when somebody asks me to do something, and I'm not interested every time, but I feel I cannot refuse to do something when it's good, because the Rebbe told me in Yechides. That's one of the reasons why I accepted to do that. And then he said, and regarding Ahavas Yisrael, you have to learn. At the time, just appeared the booklet Ahavas Yisrael. It was the first time with Mara from Derech Mitzvah Seicha and the program at Beis in Tanya. And the Rebbe said, learn it twice or three times, and you'll see the people. You'll see the people in a completely different way. And that was true. I learned it three times, and you see people much differently. It's not only Ahavas Yisrael, like a philosophical idea, as Hasidism, Ahavas Yisrael, something really practical.
So we see in this encounter that this Chassid describes with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, how first and foremost the Rebbe laid down for him how the most important thing is the deed. You're not sure if your motivations are the purest. You're not. You feel like perhaps it might make you feel haughty and above other people. You're doing something good. Focus on that, and don't let what you feel like are not the purest intentions. Don't let that stop you from doing something that is accomplishing something wonderful. So we've spoken about that, and we've explained how that is with action. But we also see how the Rebbe didn't stop there and say that's enough. The Rebbe also did give him a way to change his intentions, change his feelings, and have a different perspective, so he could have a more correct view of how he should be approaching the lectures he was giving and the other involvement that he had. In this case, it was that he should study certain discourses, certain Hasidic concepts which speak about love of a fellow Jew and how to look at another person regardless of how much they know or where they're up to. And as he attests, it did help, and it changed his entire approach. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We know the action is important. We know that we should do it as much as possible, but we want to also upgrade in order that the motivations and the intentions behind the action should enhance it. So let's think of a very practical scenario. Cast your mind back to an experience that you've had shopping in a department store, or perhaps an evening or a lunch that you've had at a restaurant. And I'm sure that you've had experiences where the salesperson or whoever the waiter or waitress was were really wonderful. They smiled, they asked how you were doing. They really had a very pleasant demeanor as they were helping you, figure out what you wanted to buy, the different options and what the differences are between them, or, being served whatever you had ordered at the restaurant. So think about that kind of an experience. Now think about the same setting, but where you perhaps encountered somebody, a salesperson or a server, who did exactly what you needed them to do. They brought you the product, they showed you the product, this size, that size, or they served you on time and gave you exactly what you had ordered, and it tasted good and it was fresh. But there was no smile or extra warmth or, how are you involved in any way. How did these two experiences compare to each other? What feelings do you have when you think about scenario number one versus the feelings that you think about, the feelings that you have when you think about scenario number two?
Well, one seems as though would having been in those scenarios as a person who has waited tables or worked in a store, there's always a way to make somebody feel good, no matter who they are, what they are.
Yeah,
Or
100%.
never to feel above one another.
Right.
And having been in situations where the service is, the person is just not, like, either not into it or rude or just not attentive or whatever, you just don't want to go back. I mean,
Right.
you just feel uncared for.
Yeah. So, I'm talking about cases where in both cases your needs or your requests or requirements have been met. But obviously the scenario where you've had that attentiveness, the smile, you'll feel much more satisfied and much more inclined to return to that store or that restaurant because you feel cared for, you feel like you matter, you feel important to the individual who is taking care of you. So if we take this illustration and we draw it back to the idea of doing a mitzvah, we can do a mitzvah, right? We can give charity, we can light Shabbat candles, we can go through the motions. The mitzvah has been done. We've fulfilled all the requirements of the specific good deed according to the way that God has laid it out. But when we do it with a smile, so to say, right, when we have that extra feeling or intention, it's a whole different kind of mitzvah. We've infused soul and depth into the mitzvah, into the good deed. If we go back to the metaphor of creating a home for God here in this world, you can build a home and it will have the foundations and the walls and the lighting and the plumbing and all the fixtures needed, a couch and a bed and all really wonderful quality, fine, completely adequate for any sort of individual, right? So that's when we do the action, just the basics. God has what he needs. God has what he's asked for. But when we bring soul and depth of feeling into the fulfillment of the mitzvah, that's like a home where you see the extra attention, the added touches of beauty, that the curtains have a beautiful pattern which matches the carpets very well. There's a plant in the corner of a room in a very appropriate place. You know, all these different things that you can live and be very comfortable in a house without plants and without extra, you know, paintings on the wall. And you won't be missing, and you won't feel lacking. But all of these added things definitely enhance and make the whole atmosphere of living in that home a completely different experience. The interesting thing is, the reason why the mitzvot have the effect that they do, the actions that we call mitzvot, that we call good deeds, why do they have the effect that they do? Because God gave those actions that power. God said, these are the things that I desire. These are the things that I want. And that's what gives them the power to have the impact of creating this home for him. God could have chosen different things. The same is true of intent and feeling and motivation. Again, because God has stated or set forth that the feeling is important to him, that's also why when we do a mitzvah with specific intent, the action becomes much more desirable to God than without the intent. We're going to read this inside the Tanya, and then I will elaborate on it more to make it more relevant to the way that we see things and the way that we behave in our own lives. So let me share that text with you. Oh. Okay. This might sound a bit Kabbalistic because it is a Kabbalah, you know, it's based on Kabbalah, the Tanya, but we will definitely be explaining it. And as always, if there are questions or things to be clarified, please let me know. So this is from chapter 38. And the word kavanah means intention. Okay, so we're going to be using that word in this paragraph. That's what it means. So not that kavanah is intrinsically superior to the action of mitzvot. Rather, it is also his blessed will that one should cleave to him with one's intelligence, thought, and intention in the active commandments. So God has a desire that aside from the technical deed that we are doing, he wants us not only to connect to him with our physical beings, with whatever physical parts of our body we are currently using to do a good deed. He also wants us to connect to him with the way that we're thinking about the mitzvah, the intention, the feelings that we have, right? He wants this to be sort of an immersive, complete connection with him as we are engaged in the different good deeds that we do. At the end of the second line, and the illumination which irradiates and pervades this kavanah is infinitely greater and more sublime than the illumination which irradiates and pervades the performance of the commandments themselves in action and speech without kavanah. This means that the spiritual light, if you like, which permeates intention, is of a greater intensity and of a greater level than the spiritual radiance that permeates just a commandment, a physical act, which can be a physical action or it can be through something that we say alone. We're going to explain this, okay? We're going to explain what it means that the spiritual radiance of our thoughts and intentions how is that? What does it mean that it's on a greater, loftier level than the spiritual radiance of just the physical commandment that we're fulfilling? Last sentence, it is comparable to the superiority of the light of the soul over the body, which is a vessel and garb for the soul, as the body of the commandment is a vessel and garb for its kavanah. So that last line is saying, is bringing an analogy that just as we have a body and a soul, right? We have a physical side to us, and we have the soul that animates and gives us life, which is spiritual. So in a similar way, a mitzvah that we do, the action or the speech is like the body, and the intention and the motivation and the feeling is like the soul of that body. So let's make this a bit more concrete and understood to our human concepts and capacity. We're going to use the analogy of a husband and a wife over here. I know we're using many metaphors and analogies. The nature of Kabbalistic learning very often is that it's taught through analogy, because we are trying to access very spiritual and lofty concepts related to the way that God exists and how he connects to the world. And as human beings who relate to very tangible, concrete things, one of the best ways for us to try and think about something that's outside of the physical realm, it's helpful when we have a more concrete analogy from which we can draw parallel. Not only are we drawing a parallel to help us understand godliness, but the actual truth is that really everything that God created in this physical world actually reflects the spiritual. So if things are a certain way down here on this earth, it's because they are true, obviously in a spiritual sense, in the higher, more spiritual realms. In Kabbalah as well, the analogy of a husband and wife is very common, because it's one of the strongest analogies of our relationship, the relationship of the Jewish people with God. God is likened to the husband and the Jewish people to the wife, which is also why there's such tremendous spiritual potential and opportunity for holiness in the relationship that a husband and a wife have. Again, what I said just before, that it's not just an analogy to help us understand, but it actually is a parallel. It parallels the physical as a parallel to what's taking place in the spiritual. So let's look at this relationship, okay? So if a wife asks her husband to do something for her, the husband, without hesitation, comes along and does whatever it is that she requests. Or even let's say the wife says, I'd really love to be able to sit down to dinner at this specific time every single day. Yeah, I would appreciate if you'd make the effort to be home at 6 o'clock or whatever time. So let's imagine your husband from that day on, without any further comment, begins coming on time at that time. And you're able to sit, and the dinner is fresh and hot at the time that it's supposed to be, and it's so pleasant and wonderful. But the husband is not specifically warm about it, or describing how wonderful it is that he's able to come home at this time. He's just doing it as a fulfillment of your request and a desire that you have. Another scenario would be where the husband begins to come home on time, and he says, "Of course, dear, it would be my pleasure." And then he arrives, that evening to dinner. "This is so wonderful. What a great idea you had. We're really able to enjoy the food much more." All this kind of demeanor and talk. So again, in both of these scenarios, the wife's requests and desire has been met, right? She asked for her husband to be home at this time, and he's coming home on time. But obviously, you cannot compare the feelings that exist or the atmosphere that's created in the two different scenarios. Okay, another similar kind of example. A husband and a wife are sitting outside on the deck. Husband is reading the newspaper or his Kindle or whatever other technological equivalent that we all like to use in today's day and age. Wife is sitting and looking out at it's a beautiful day, like a day like we had today. And all of a sudden a brightly colored bird flies and lands on the railing in front of them. And she says, "Oh, wow, look, what a beautiful bird." And the husband, lifts his eyes from whatever he's reading and, "Oh yeah, it's a nice bird," and then goes back to whatever it is that he's in the middle of. Or the husband could put down the newspaper, the Kindle, and look at the bird. "Wow, it really is beautiful. I mean, look at the color and look at the elegant beak that it has," or whatever, and to start to get really into the details of how it's so beautiful. So it's not really what the conversation is about, right? They could be talking about a bird, they could be talking about the news, they could be talking about something that means a lot to one or the other of them. But you can see from the demeanor and the talk and the reaction of your spouse when they care to speak in this kind of way, and become more involved in whatever you requested or whatever you showed interest in, that really makes you feel like, wow, my spouse really cares about me, about what I'm interested in, not because they necessarily care about beautiful birds, but because I care about beautiful birds, it's going to become something that they care about. So if we think about God as well, are we just going through the motions? Or are we showing God that we truly are in this relationship? We're doing something for him because it means something to him and it's special for him. And we can do that, but when we show that we care about this detail or that detail, it's sort of this kind of indication that we're not just looking to check off the box that we did whatever we were supposed to, but we're doing this because God matters to us, and therefore what matters to him matters to us. If your husband you want him to hang something on the wall, and he does it and he leaves, or he says, did you want it like this, or did you want it like that, and making sure that it's exactly the way that you would do it if you were doing it yourself. It's just a different it's a different feeling in a relationship, and it's a much deeper relationship that exists. So this is what we're talking about when we are discussing doing mitzvot and good deeds with feeling, with intention, to detail, with care, that it be done, in the best way that we know how to do it. I'm going to share another short encounter from another individual with the Rebbe that speaks to this particular idea.
So the three of us went to see the Rebbe, myself, my ex-wife, and her father, my father-in-law, and Mr. Ratner, Maurice Ratner. Before, when we were waiting there, they came up to me and said, they told me I should write out a note for the Rebbe, some request. And I told them I have no requests, and I have nothing I want from the Rebbe. I was just here to facilitate my wife and helping her in, and other than that, I was just a bystander. I'd be sitting in the back. So there was no need for me to write anything. And they were very, very insistent that I couldn't go in unless I wrote something. So, with that ultimatum, I just said, if God's so great, why does he insist on all these tiny details? Why can't he skip? And that's all. That's the only question I had. And just because he told me I had to write something. And it always did bother me that if God was so great, why was he stuck with all these tiny details? And it seemed to upset him if he missed one. And if you used a meat spoon and cottage cheese, you have to go bury it and pull your hair on it. So I could never get that. It really was beyond me. So that's basically what I was asking the Rebbe, is what all the angst was about. So he began by asking each one of us our names, and I told him my name was Avram David, and he asked our mother's name too, Ben Malka, and my ex said Yochevet Chana Bas Pina, and my father-in-law said Moshe Ben Chana, and the Rebbe just stopped and he began tapping with his pencil. We all just looked, and the Rebbe addressed my father and says, your son-in-law has two names and your daughter has two names. My father thought, he said, oh, my mother's name is Hannah Hendel. The Rebbe just nodded and wrote that down too. And then he turned to me and he said, I don't understand your question. So I thought it was pretty forthright. So I started to say it in Yiddish, thinking maybe he had difficulty with English. And he stopped me, put his hand up. He said, it's not for God, it's for us. And I could see, I'm told God wants us close to him, and this is the path he gives us. It's like he gave a path, and he said, if you follow this path, you'll find me. And it's not that if you don't follow this path, I'm going to blind you or I'll hurt you. Just the opposite. I want you to come close, and here I'm giving you a path, a means in which you can find this proximity, this closeness with me. It was a very radical thought to me. I had never ever seen Judaism in that light. It was always focused on what was forbidden and the consequences of doing what's forbidden. It was in yeshiva, it was the way everything was taught, with the slap, with the hit, and you're no good, and Osvorf. So I had more than my field Judaism, and but this really intrigued me. I was very taken. I felt as though I was in a dark room and someone had opened up a light.
And he went again for his
So this individual describes how his upbringing and the education he received in whichever school and yeshiva system he had been educated left him feeling that, I better fulfill the commandments or else, God's going to punish me. I'm awful if I don't do what God wants, and I'm going to suffer. And he was very taken how the Rebbe presented it to him in a completely different light. That, as human beings, we don't know how to approach God on our own. We don't know what's meaningful to him on our own. And God has made it accessible to us to be able to come close to him. And he has told us specifically, these are, you fulfill these mitzvot, you do these things. These are all ways that you can have a relationship with me and draw close to me. Because God wants that from us. He wants that relationship and he wants that connection to us. And you can see how that is obviously a completely different perspective, and gives a completely different attitude and feeling towards fulfilling any good deed and any mitzvah that a person does. So that concludes the idea of how our intentions and feelings behind the deeds that we do, how those can be an indication of and an enhancement to our connection and relationship with God. We're now going to take intention in a bit of a different direction. We're going to talk more about the effect and the impact of our actions. So we spoke about how when we utilize physical things, human resources, objects, our bodies, to do a mitzvah, then we are making them a vehicle and a receptacle for godliness. But I think we need to talk about it a little bit more, because we talk about the fact that a mitzvah is powerful and it has an impact. But really, when we look around the world, we can have difficulty actually visibly appreciating how the new reality of this particular object is now that it's got a level of holiness to it. I mean, if we have a prayer book or a Torah scroll, that might feel holy to us. But if I have an apple and I made a blessing on it, do I sense that the godliness that's been inserted into that apple right now? Not as much. So some of the good deeds that we do see the impact much more readily. Let's say, if, giving charity to a wonderful cause. So we give charity, it enables that cause to continue, or what it's doing, or develop new programs. And we see, somebody's not going hungry, or somebody's getting an education, or whatever it is. We see the effect. Well, if it's prayer, let's say, if we decide that we enjoy praying and we'd like to focus on that a bit more, prayer connects us with God. It refines us internally and spiritually. So if we invest in that, then we might get that sense. We might start to feel more connected to God, hopefully. And we hopefully will also feel a bit more spiritually refined, right? Even the mitzvot that are connected to morals and ethics, being a just, upright person. We can see the impact and the benefits of that. We can see how an ethical society and a moral society is a much better place to live and does much more good. Then there are other mitzvahs that we do. We don't see the impact at all. Now but in addition to that, there's also a spiritual impact that all mitzvot have. Okay, even a mitzvah that we see the impact of it. Okay, let's go back to all the examples I just brought. That's one level of impact, but there's really much deeper, more spiritual effects that are taking place that we absolutely cannot sense or access. We're not aware of them. So what are those effects? What is that impact? And will we and do we ever see how that comes into play? So this leads us to talking about the time of the Mashiach, or as it's commonly translated in English, the time of the Messiah. Okay, now, because the word Messiah and the Messianic era is used in different contexts and under different religions, we might have complicated associations with it, because it might connote certain things in the way we think about that concept. But tonight I'm gonna, in a nutshell, going to describe to you what the Jewish concept of Messiah is, of the time of the Mashiach is, and what that has to do with the mitzvot that we do, and the good deeds that we do now. So this is a really short text, again from the Tanya. I'm just going to share it before I explain. Okay, we're jumping back a little bit to chapter 37. The ultimate perfection of this world, which will exist in the Messianic era and the time of the resurrection of the dead, meaning the revelation of the infinite light in this physical world, is dependent on our actions and service throughout the period of exile. For it is the mitzvah itself that generates its own reward. Okay, so again, a bit abstract. We talked about how our actions perfect the world and bring it to a greater level of holiness and godliness. But when are we going to see that perfection? When are we going to feel the impact, as I said before, of the godly revelation that comes from our physical actions? So this revelation is going to take place. It's dependent. This revelation and perfection is dependent upon the things that we do, and it's going to become apparent and visible at the time of the Mashiach. Why? For it is the mitzvah itself that generates its own reward. Okay, and I'm going to explain what that means. So As I just mentioned, we don't see those spiritual effects, the spiritual impact. That is only going to be revealed to us once we reach that era of visible perfection and beauty in the world. Okay, everything over the course of history that Jewish people and we have been, and all people have been perfecting and uplifting over the course of all these years, it's going to become apparent at that time. Let's imagine it like a deposit in your bank account, right? When a deposit is made into your bank account, you don't know that it's been made. You don't know that it's there. Only once you go utilize the tools that you have online on an app or whatever, then you can go and look and you'll see, oh yes, I have now an extra however much in my bank account. But at the time that the money is deposited, you're not instantly aware of that new reality. So the same is true of when we are doing a good deed and we're impacting the world. Something is happening on a basic level, on a deeper level, on a very lofty level. We're not necessarily conscious or sensitive to it at that particular time. At the time of the Mashiach, that's going to be the time when we're going to see the fruits of everything that we have deposited in our spiritual bank accounts. What does intention have to do with all this? What does motivation and feeling and the fulfillment of a mitzvah have to do with all of this? When we do a mitzvah and we don't just stick to the basic technical fulfillment of it, but we invest ourselves, our feelings and our thoughts and our motivations in the best way we know into that mitzvah, it magnifies the intensity of a mitzvah's spiritual impact. So if we're talking about creating a home for God, and not just a home where he has what he needs in the best way, but a home where you have that additional brightness and additional beauty and special touches, that comes from the intent. And we're going to see that and appreciate that at the time when the spiritual results of everything we're doing becomes visible, which is going to be the time of the Mashiach. So I guess if you want to say it in a short kind of way, the spiritual, if a mitzvah will shine and have a specific spiritual intensity and brightness, the level of intensity and spiritual brightness that a mitzvah will have is impacted by the thoughts, the feelings, and the motivations that we have as we fulfill that mitzvah, that good deed. So this leads us to another important point about the time of the Mashiach, which is that it might, at first glance, it might seem as though we do good deeds, we try to do the right thing, and then God rewards us at the end with an era where the world exists in a state of peace, of harmony, of goodness, of beauty. There's no negativity, suffering, evil. But there's an important distinction to make, which is that, you know, if you think about a child and you would like them to motivate them to do something. So let's say you'd like them to clean their room. The child is not interested in cleaning the room. They don't feel like it right now. They're lazy. They want to do it tomorrow. So you tell the child, I'll give you ice cream if you clean your room. And of course, the child is very motivated and goes ahead, does a great job, cleans the room very nicely, and then you give them the ice cream. Is there any connection between what they've done and the reward they received? No, there's absolutely no connection between ice cream and a clean room. It's an external motivation that helped the child do something that they found unpleasant. And after they finished, they were rewarded. This is not what the time of the Mashiach is. The time of the Mashiach is not an external motivation. There's a special reward coming if you behave and you do what you're supposed to do. That's not what the time of the Mashiach is. The time of the Mashiach, as we quoted from the Tanya, the reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. The actions and the things that we are doing now directly enable that kind of atmosphere and that kind of reality to exist when the time of the Mashiach comes. Because it's a reality that we've been creating all along, since the beginning of time, all throughout history, up until today. Every time we do a good deed, every time we do something for God, every time we do a mitzvah, especially, and when we also upgrade that by doing it with feeling and with meaning, we are transforming and bringing that reality into the world, bit by bit, with each and every deed that we do, each of us individually and collectively. The time of the Mashiach is going to be just that time when God says, okay, it's time to pull back the veil. It's time to take away the curtains and show us what is the accomplishment, what are the results of everything that we've been doing up until now. So the reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. The reward that we are receiving, that wonderful utopian time of absolute goodness, it's a direct consequence and result and outgrowth of what we are doing now. And that's why it's called the mitzvah itself. It's the impact of what we ourselves have done. So just to conclude and to bring everything together, we spoke this week about the added value of having feeling and intention when we are fulfilling a mitzvah, when we are doing any sort of good deed. We spoke about it specifically in light of having a relationship with God and wanting to develop it into a deeper, more meaningful, more selfless relationship with Him, where there's, so to say, in the analogy, true caring and true desire to do what means something to the other. And the second concept that we discussed was the fact that there are different impacts that good deeds have. Some we can see, but even with the mitzvah that we can see, there are deeper, more spiritual impacts that we can't see. And the degree of the intent that we have in fulfilling a mitzvah enhances and transforms and amplifies the mitzvah that we have done. And when are we going to realize and recognize all of these results and all of the efforts that we are making? It's going to be at that time known as the time of the Mashiach or the Messiah, which is when God will say, okay, it's time for me to show you what's in your bank accounts. I'm going to take away the sunglasses, and you'll be able to really appreciate everything that you have accomplished over all of these years. So that ends the